On the morning of the 17th of January, 1885, Brigadier-General Sir Herbert Stewart formed a British square in the Bayuda Desert, not far from the wells of Abu Klea. His men were tired from a hard march across Sudan. Their camels were restless, and somewhere ahead of them, thousands of Mahdist warriors were waiting in the broken ground. The square was supposed to make the column almost impossible to overwhelm. Rifles faced outwards, guns covered the front. Camels, wounded men and supplies were packed inside. Then the formation almost became a trap. Mahdist fighters burst from a dry ravine, drove towards the British line, and found the one thing Stewart could not afford them to find: a weak corner. The Gardner gun jammed after a short burst of fire. Sailors of the Naval Brigade were cut down around it. Colonel Fred Burnaby, one of the most famous soldiers in the Empire, was killed in the chaos. For a few terrible minutes, the enemy was inside the square. So how did a British column survive when the formation built to protect it almost became the place where it died? The answer begins more than 200 miles away, in Khartoum, where General Charles Gordon had been trapped by the forces of Mohammed Ahmed, the self-proclaimed Mahdi. Gordon had reached the Sudanese capital in February 1884 with instructions connected to the withdrawal of Egyptian garrisons from Sudan. But instead of simply leaving, he stayed in the city as the Mahdist revolt closed around it. By May, Khartoum was under siege. Britain tried to avoid another major Sudan campaign, but Gordon had already become a public symbol at home: the Christian soldier, the imperial hero, the man alone in the city while time ran out. Sir Garnet Wolseley was sent to organize the relief. He had a reputation for efficiency, and his task was urgent but brutally difficult. Khartoum lay deep inland, and the Nile route was slow. Boats could carry men and supplies, but the river bent north and south in a long curve, and each day on the water cost Gordon more time. Wolseley therefore created a faster but far more dangerous option: a desert column under Sir Herbert Stewart, sent across the Bayuda Desert to cut the great bend of the Nile and reach Metemmeh, from where steamers might push on towards Khartoum. Stewart's force was a strange army for a strange race. It included camel-mounted troops formed from several British units in Egypt, men of the Guards Camel Regiment, the Heavy Camel Regiment, the Mounted Infantry Camel Regiment, a small naval brigade with a Gardner machine gun, light guns, and a detachment of the 19th Hussars. These were not fresh parade ground soldiers marching down a road. They were men trying to move through desert with camels, ammunition, water, wounded comrades, and the knowledge that the mission only mattered if they arrived in time. The Bayuda Desert punished speed. Water was everything. Wells became objectives as important as towns. A column could not simply march where it pleased, because men and animals had to drink, or the rescue would collapse before it reached the enemy. Abu Klea mattered because its wells lay on the route. If Stewart could take them, the column could continue towards the Nile. If he failed, the attempt to save Gordon might die in the desert before Khartoum was even in sight. The Mahdists understood this. They were not a disorganized crowd waiting to be swept aside by modern rifles. Their movement had already destroyed Egyptian forces and shaken British confidence in Sudan. They were motivated, brave, used to the terrain, and capable of waiting in ground where a British officer might see only emptiness. At Abu Klea, they did not need to defeat the British in a long campaign. They needed to stop the desert column long enough for Khartoum to remain beyond reach. Stewart reached the area near Abu Klea on the 16th of January. The Mahdist force was visible enough to make clear that the next day would not be a quiet march to water. The British formed a defensive zareba for the night, using thorn and baggage to protect themselves while enemy riflemen harassed them from surrounding ground. Men slept badly, if they slept at all. They knew that the wells were close, but the distance between a thirsty army and water can be filled with death. Before the square starts moving, write in the comments where you are watching from. Abu Klea was fought in the Sudanese desert, but its story belongs to anyone who wants to understand what happens when a rescue mission becomes a battle for survival. On the morning of the 17th, Stewart chose to advance in square. This was not a romantic Victorian pose. It was a practical formation designed for danger from every side. Infantry squares had been used for decades against cavalry and irregular attacks because they gave all-round defense and kept the vulnerable center protected. At Abu Klea, the center held camels, wounded men, ammunition, and supplies. The faces of the square were made up of troops whose rifles could fire outwards while the formation moved towards the wells. But a moving square is harder to keep than a square drawn in a drill book. The ground was rough. The camels inside the formation slowed movement. The Gardner gun and light artillery had to be dragged and adjusted. Men trained for cavalry or camel-mounted service were being asked to perform infantry tasks under pressure. Every uneven patch of desert threatened the shape of the formation. Every halt risked confusion. Every delay gave the Mahdists more time to watch. At first, enemy riflemen fired from a distance. Their shooting caused casualties, but the greater danger remained hidden. The Mahdist main body was concealed in a dry watercourse, a wadi that masked their numbers until they were ready to strike. The British could see enough to know they were in danger, but not enough to understand exactly how the attack would come. The column moved forward slowly, painfully, with the square trying to remain whole while the desert pulled at its edges. Then the Mahdists came. They emerged from the ravine in a rush, not as men without order, but as a sudden mass aimed at the formation's vulnerable side. The charge had a terrifying logic. If the attackers threw themselves against the strongest face, rifle fire and guns might tear them apart before they reached the line. Instead, they moved along the left side and towards the rear left corner, where the formation was already under strain. They had found the place where the square was least secure. The Naval Brigade's Gardner gun became part of the crisis. Captain Lord Charles Beresford had the gun brought into a position where it could fire on the attackers, but the weapon was heavy, awkward, and unsuited to the sand and stress of the moment. It fired briefly, then jammed. The jam did not merely silence a useful weapon, it created confusion at precisely the point where the line needed perfect steadiness. The sailors around the gun fought, but the Mahdists were almost on them. Men were killed at the piece. Beresford himself narrowly survived. The corner fractured. Once that happened, Abu Klea changed from a controlled advance into a close fight for the existence of the column. Mahdist warriors forced their way into the square, where the interior was crowded with camels, wounded men, and supplies. That crowding, dangerous as it was, also stopped the attackers from rushing cleanly through the formation. The British ranks turned inwards where they had to. Men who had been firing out suddenly faced enemies inside the space that was meant to be protected. The square did not simply stand untouched, it had to repair itself while being attacked from within. This is the moment that makes Abu Klea so powerful as a story of British discipline under pressure. The formation had failed at the point where failure should have been fatal, yet enough men still understood what had to be done. They did not have time for a perfect order. They had to close the broken corner, shoot into the mass of attackers without tearing their own formation apart, and prevent the panic of seeing enemy fighters inside the square from becoming collapse. Colonel Fred Burnaby was killed during this struggle. He was not just another officer to the British public. Burnaby was a celebrity soldier, a huge man, an adventurer of the old imperial type, known for his travels and physical courage. His death gave the battle a dramatic symbol, but the survival of the column depended less on one famous death than on the steadiness of many less famous men. The square was recovered through hard, close, brutal fighting. Bayonets, rifles, swords, and sheer physical resistance did the work that formation alone could no longer do. The Mahdist warriors fought with extraordinary courage. They had crossed killing ground under Martini Henry fire, reached a British square, overwhelmed the gun detachment, and entered the formation itself. To present them as merely reckless would make the British survival less meaningful. These were determined fighters who believed deeply in their cause and were willing to take terrible losses to stop the column. The British won because they held under that pressure, not because the pressure was light. The fighting was short in time and enormous in consequence. In the space of minutes, Stewart's force went from a disciplined desert advance to the edge of disaster and back. When the Mahdist attack was finally driven out and the square was reformed, the ground around the column showed the cost. British casualties were heavy for such a brief action. The Mahdists suffered far more, with around 1,100 killed according to the National Army Museum's summary, but they had come close enough to expose the weakness inside British confidence. If you want more stories where military history comes down to one formation, one decision, and men refusing to break under impossible pressure, subscribe to the channel. And write in the comments where you are watching from, because Abu Klea was fought in the desert, but the question it raises is universal. What holds an army together when its shape begins to fail? After the square was restored, Stewart's men still had to continue. This is easy to forget. A battle does not end for the men inside it at the moment a narrator says victory. They still had wounded to carry, dead to count, weapons to recover, animals to control, and water to reach. The column had survived Abu Klea, but the mission to save Gordon had not been completed. The wells still mattered. The Nile still lay ahead. Khartoum was still waiting. The psychological effect of the battle must have been severe. The infantry square was supposed to embody order. Every man knew where danger was meant to be. Outside. Abu Klea violated that certainty. Once the Mahdists entered the square, the protected center became part of the battlefield. Camels screamed and struggled. Wounded men lay among confusion. Officers and non-commissioned officers had to make soldiers face danger from directions no square was meant to allow. The fact that the formation recovered makes the moment more impressive, not less. Stewart's leadership was tested in a very particular way. He had chosen speed over safety by taking the desert column across the Bayuda, and then he had chosen the square because he knew the column could be attacked from any side. When the corner broke, leadership could not be abstract. It had to be felt through the men who turned, fired, closed, and obeyed amid dust, smoke, and sudden fear. A commander can design the formation, but soldiers must keep it alive when the design is damaged. The Naval Brigade paid heavily for the Gardner gun's position and failure. Victorian Britain loved machines that promised control: rifles, artillery, gunboats, telegraphs, railways, mechanical fire. Abu Klea showed that technology could fail at the worst possible second. The Gardner gun was not useless. It was simply not the miracle that could replace discipline. When it jammed, the sailors and soldiers around it had to fight by hand and rifle like everyone else. A machine had failed, and men had to close the gap. The heavy camel regiment also found itself in the most dangerous part of the fight. Many of its men came from cavalry backgrounds, and at Abu Klea, they were fighting as infantry inside a moving square in desert terrain. That mattered because formations are not just shapes, they are habits. Infantry trained to dress lines, close gaps, and hold faces under pressure had instincts that camel-mounted cavalrymen did not possess in the same way. The crisis at the rear left corner was not caused by cowardice. It came from the difficulty of forcing an improvised column to behave like a perfect infantry machine in conditions that punished every imperfection. Still, the men held. That is the center of the story. Not that the British square was flawless, because it was not. Not that the battle was a clean display of imperial superiority, because it nearly became a disaster. The power of Abu Klea lies in the fact that the British formation cracked and then did not collapse. The column survived the one thing it had been designed to prevent. It absorbed the shock of men inside the square and recovered before the breach could become destruction. The victory allowed Stewart to continue towards the Nile. 2 days later, on the 19th of January, the column fought again near Abu Klea, or Gubat, as it pushed towards Metemme. During this phase of the advance, Stewart was mortally wounded and eventually handed command to Sir Charles Wilson. The relief mission was still alive, but its leader had been struck down, its men were exhausted, and every hour mattered more than before. Wilson and the column finally reached the Nile and made contact with steamers that could move towards Khartoum. But the race had already been lost. On the 28th of January, the relief force reached Khartoum and discovered that the city had fallen 2 days earlier. Gordon was dead. The man Britain had marched across river and desert to rescue had been killed before help arrived. That ending changes the meaning of Abu Klea. Tactically, it was a British victory. The Mahdist attack was repulsed. The square survived. The column reached the wells and continued. But strategically and emotionally, the story is darker. The men had fought one of the most savage actions of the Sudan campaign, crossed impossible ground, survived the breach of their square, and still arrived too late to save the man whose name had driven the expedition. This is why Abu Klea should not be told as a simple triumph. It is a story of courage inside failure. The British soldiers did what soldiers could do. They marched, formed square, held their nerve, fought hand to hand, closed the breach, and carried the mission forward. The failure lay in time, politics, distance, and delay. Wolseley's expedition had been organized under public pressure after months of hesitation, and once the race began, the desert and the Mahdist siege clock were already working against it. For Britain, Gordon's death became a national humiliation. The public had followed his isolation in Khartoum, and the discovery that the relief had arrived 2 days too late turned the campaign into a wound in imperial memory. Abu Klea therefore occupied an uneasy place. It gave Britain a heroic battlefield image, the square under attack, Burnaby falling, men closing the breach. But it sat inside a rescue mission that failed at its central purpose. The Mahdists, too, emerged from the battle with their reputation strengthened in a different way. They had not destroyed Stewart's column, but they had broken into one of the most respected British formations of the 19th century. They had shown that discipline and rifles did not make British troops untouchable. They had inflicted serious casualties and delayed the advance. Their courage at Abu Klea forced even British writers to acknowledge the ferocity and commitment of their attack. Years later, Winston Churchill would call Abu Klea one of the most savage and bloody actions fought by British troops in Sudan. The phrase endured because it captured the compressed violence of the fight. This was not a battle of slow maneuver or elegant tactics. It was a short, brutal collision between a rescue column trying to reach water and a Mahdist force determined to stop it. The British square did not break in the comfortable poetic sense of total ruin, but it was penetrated, and that was enough to make the battle unforgettable. The lesson of Abu Klea is not that British formations were invincible. The lesson is more interesting. A formation is only as strong as the men who repair it when it fails. Stewart's square worked not because nothing went wrong, but because when the worst thing happened, the soldiers inside did not dissolve into a crowd. They turned inwards. They fought through the gap. They closed the formation again. Sometimes heroism is not the perfect execution of a plan. Sometimes it is the recovery after the plan almost kills you. At Abu Klea, the British square was supposed to protect the desert column from the desert, the Mahdists, and the fear of being surrounded. For a few minutes, that protection failed. The enemy was inside. The gun had jammed. Burnaby was dead. The camels and wounded filled the center. The line was no longer an idea from a drill book. It was a living thing, damaged and close to collapse. And still, it held. If this story changed the way you see the Gordon Relief Expedition, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which battle, commander or regiment, before 1900 we should break down next.